This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Auto insurance can all seem the same until it comes time to use it. So don't get stuck paying more for less coverage. Switch to USAA Auto Insurance and you could start saving money in no time. Get a quote today. Restrictions apply.
USAA. This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
By all means, correct my pronunciation, because I prefer to be corrected than to be continuously going, Susan Seidelman when it's Seidelman of Vicky Verkey.
This whole time, I thought it was Brady Corbett. And then I heard someone say Brady Corbet, and I was like, what? Like, going all the way back to Vox Lux, I thought it was Brady Corbett. And his name is pronounced Corbet, and I'm like, what? So I get it.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I am being joined by a friend and writer, Marya Gates. Hi Marya.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Great to have you. I think, where did we first meet? We met in... Karlovy Vary?
Karlovy Vary, yeah.
What a wonderful town that is.
It was at the after party of that Danish film that was so good, Lovable.
That sounds about right. Yeah. It's a wonderful spa town.
Oh, I love Karlovy Vary. It's not just a lovable spa town. It's the best, in my opinion, film festival in terms of the way it treats its critics. It is so nice to critics. They're so welcoming. I really love it. They don't make your life, like, they don't put you through like hurdles to get to the movie so that you're like tired and hungry and hangry, and you might be meaner on a movie at a lot of festivals just because you're so tired. And Karlovy Vary is like, we want you in the best mindset so you will love these movies, which I guess is like perfect for the setting of a spa.
I saw Love Lies Bleeding, the Kristen Stewart film there, and Rose Glass, and at the beginning of the film they said, we don't have any of the talent of the film, the director and the actor can't be here, but we've got something better. And they brought on like the national bodybuilding champion, female bodybuilding champion, and she did a workout for the audience, and everybody on your feet, and they played music, and it was like,
that's amazing.
It was one of the most phenomenal, and that movie, it's totally fits.
I mean, I wish I had been at that screening. Dang.
You would never have got an audience in Cannes jumping to their feet and doing that.
No. I mean, the Karlovy Vary really, just from the opening ceremony, just gets you in this like amazing quirky mood, and it never lets up the whole festival.
Marya, you've written this wonderful book, Cinema Her Way, Visionary Female Directors, and the idea for this book, or the sort of inspiration of this book, came from you having a year in which you decided, that's it, I'm not going to watch films by anybody except female directors. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, it sort of was a couple-year process where I had seen a couple of documentaries, both directed by women, about, in particular, these documentaries were actually music documentaries, but they were both looking at sort of the ways that canons are built by exclusion a lot of times. One was about female jazz musicians. One was about Kathleen Hanna, riot girl, punk singer. And it really made me start thinking about like how I accepted canons at face value, how I accepted Best Picture at face value, the AFI list at face value, all these things. And I didn't realize or even really contemplate the bias in a lot of these systems, or like just the books I studied I was a lit major, and I, read some books by women, but it was, I think, probably at least 75% books by men. And I never even questioned it. Right. Those documentaries made me start questioning it. So the next year I started watching a few more films. I made a an effort. I did a thing on my blog called Female Filmmaker Friday, where I wrote about a different woman every Friday, sometimes one film, sometimes several films in their filmography. I discovered the films of Susan Seidelman, who I'd never heard of, and she has this amazing run, 5 amazing films in the 80s. Then she had a short film nominated for an Oscar. Then she directed the pilot of Second City. How had I never heard of her? How is she not talked about as one of the great filmmakers of that era? I truly don't understand it, other than the fact that every single one of her films are so distinctly about the experience of women around the same age as her, right? So at that same time, I saw a bunch of lists, most of which had maybe one film by a woman on it. And I was like, well, that's bullshit. Then there were counter lists, but it was always like, IndieWire or somebody would do 10 female filmmakers you should know, and it would always be the same 10 names. Sometimes it would only be 5 names, but it would be the same, Jane Campion, Catherine Bigelow, Ava DuVernay, Sofia Coppola were out. And I'm like, okay, it's not, it's you have to point out the bias, you have to point out the sad numbers, but you can't just say, but now here are these 10 recommendations, and it be the same 10 women, because then all you're doing is continuing to perpetuate that there are only 10 women who've ever made films, because most people need a little nudge, or they take the information, just like I did, at face value. And so if you're only presenting the same 10 women, then that just reinforces something that's not true. So I was like, well, if I do a 365, I can do, I did a few repeat filmmakers, but for the most part, that's I was aiming to do over 300 different women in a year. Older films filling up some gaps, newer films just to prove that, like, if you wanted to, you could go to the cinema and or VOD and or streaming. Although streaming was very new in 2015, and watch and have a fulfilling year of brand new films, all made by women. And so that's what I did. And so it was a little bit of discovery for me, a little bit of a challenge, and a little bit of a social protest of like, it's possible, it's doable, these women exist. Why aren't we putting our money where our mouths are? If I don't work at Warner Brothers. I did at the time, but I didn't work in casting. And I don't work at, I actually did. I worked at Rotten Tomatoes at the time, which was owned by Warner Brothers. But, like, we as viewers, as critics, as podcasters, as programmers, whatever, we can't do the hiring, right? But what we can do is supporting. And the fact of the matter is, I've said this for 10 years, and I'm a little disappointed that it hasn't really changed all that much, is that we can't change who's getting hired, especially in the Hollywood system. But I know for a fact, more women are making films at the lower level, especially on streaming, especially in independent film. They are still not getting the same coverage. They're getting the programming. At the time, Sundance was pretty good with films directed by women, but now Sundance is 50% directed by women. TIFF is 50% directed by women. These films exist, but the coverage is not there. The knowledge of, like, I think people are still more willing to take a risk on a first-time male director in terms of what they're going to watch at a festival than they are a first-time female director. See somebody like Alicia Rowicher have to break out on her 4th film in the United States. Like, I love it, and I'm glad that, it sold out. I think La Chimera played at a theater in New York for 5 months. Like, that's amazing. I wish they had had that same passion for her earlier films,
Quite so.
So all of that to say that, like, it's really, for me, I think the main thing I wanted from that project and from this book and from pretty much everything that I do when I am doing what I do in the world is to facilitate discovery, because I don't think there's any way to really change the situation other than awareness. Awareness, and then how to help people put that awareness into action, which is knowing the names to look for, knowing the films to look for. I have a newsletter where I tell people literally where the films are playing so they can just click a link if they live in one of those cities. And I hope that this book, even though it's 19 main interviews, there are a lot of other women in films mentioned. There's a whole appendix in the back with another almost 400 names. I hope it'll be a launching point for a lot of people to really address their bias, address their gaps in their knowledge, and feel excited to explore a lot of filmographies and a lot of careers of filmmakers that they either have never heard of, but like me, I had never seen, for A Year with Women, I had never seen any of Karan Kusama's So, no, I guess I had seen not Girl Fight. I'd seen, what was the one I'd seen? Jennifer's Body. Who was I thinking of? I'd never seen from their filmography. Somebody on here. Oh, I think it was Betty Gordon. I'd never seen Variety. I'd never seen, I think Sally Potter. I don't know that I'd seen any of her films, but I'd always heard of Orlando. Mira Nair, I think I'd seen Vanity Fair, maybe. So like I really dived into her beyond the Reese Witherspoon movie, and it was just really rewarding to fill the gaps I had and to discover, over the last 10 years, I've probably discovered several thousand filmmakers, not all of which I'm going to follow forever, but like quite a few that, if their name pops up, I'm like, I'm seeing their next movie. So that's what I want to inspire in people.
That's the thing, isn't it? Is there comes a point of where you're elevating and you're embracing and you're shining light on people. That's actually, I quite rightly say, as writers and podcasters, that's all we can really do is hopefully encourage and make people aware of these. And I loved reading your book because it was a revelation to me, not because I didn't necessarily know these directors, but in some cases I would go, oh wow, they directed that film. It wasn't immediately apparent that, oh wow, I actually know much more of this than I do, and I hadn't necessarily put the film in a category of female director, which I think is a sort of constant theme in your book of the directors sort of saying, I mean, they don't all agree, so I don't want to make that mistake, but saying we don't want to be talked about as female directors. We just talk about us as directors.
Yeah, and that was the main, when I emailed all of the women that I wanted to speak to, I made it very clear I am not going to put a mic in their face and say, what's it like to be a woman? Because I find that very limiting. I also, especially some of the filmmakers who started working in the 70s and 80s, it was really hard to find interviews while I was researching where they were asked about the filmmaking, not about being a woman. And I think that's very condescending. I would never do that. Some of the women did obviously share from a perspective of being a woman in the industry, right? Because that's you can't remove that from the experience, right? But I didn't ask for that because I didn't want to start from that perspective. I wanted to start from, you are a filmmaker, right? Like I asked every single one of them, when did you know you wanted to become a filmmaker?
That's my opening gambit as well.
It's super fun because some people kind of know, some people don't know. Gina Prince Bythewood had this amazing clarity moment when she was in college that she shares where she absolutely knew. Others are like, I just liked storytelling and fell into, but I find that in reading a lot of interviews with women directors over the last 10 plus years, that's not a question they're asked a lot. Thematics is not a question women are asked a lot. Just the basic nitty gritty of how do you go about taking a script and turning it into a visual medium is not really something women are often talked about. So part of the reason I wanted to focus specifically on women in a sense, not because they are different, but because they are not asked these questions, right? But they're also often, I found, not discussed as if they have fully fledged careers. We're just starting to see thematic career retrospectives of Chantal Akerman and Agnes Varda and some of these others that are very clearly have huge bodies of work, right? You're just starting to see Jane Campion just had her first retrospective in Los Angeles 3 years ago when Power of the Dog came out. That was the first one retrospective of her career ever. It's crazy how many filmmakers who are nowhere near as good as Jane Campion have had retrospectives, programmed. So I wanted to make sure that with these women in particular, I was talking to filmmakers who had, even if they were mid-career, had a full body of work that they could talk about, just to, again, dispel another myth that there aren't women who have full bodies of work, and that there are, I have 19 on here, but my initial list of who I was thinking of talking to for this book was 100 names, all of whom had 3 or more feature films. So I knew I could delve really deep into the beginning, middle, and for some of the women towards the end of their careers. And I don't know that I see that often. I don't know that people think, programmers even think to do retrospectives. Same with Sally Potter. You're just starting to see in the UK, I think, some really wonderful Sally Potter retrospectives. I think the BFI maybe had a whole season with her films a few years ago. And I think that's something people should think about is why, why do you think, yeah, we can do a Michael Mann retrospective, but you don't think we can do a Susan Seidelman retrospective? Why are the films not looked at that way? Why are the filmmakers not looked at that way? And it is, I think, because of whether internal, purposeful, I don't know, a bias. I think because of the misinformation. I don't even think it's a malicious bias, to be honest. I do just think the headlines are so like prevalent of there's no women, and it's like no, they are women. There's just no support, And so I'm hoping to push against that. Yeah.
I love the story that Gillian Armstrong tells, and I think this speaks to because on one level you've got a basic problem of a filmmaker or a situation of a filmmaker shooting a big scene, and they've got press coming on set, and she's doing what every director does. I've been on a set. You don't see the director shouting at anybody. The AD shouts at everybody. The assistant director is that's what they're paid for. That's their job. And because that's what's happening, the press are like, oh, there's a guy directing this film for her. She's not actually doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, because the press have no idea how it's actually done. Yeah.
Well, some of the press.
Yeah, some of the. I particularly liked, not liked because it was a really horrible thing to hear, but Gillian talking about how she knew that while she was making this film, because she was the first woman to make a feature film in Australia in decades, and the only one to make it within an industry, the women who had made it before her were independent filmmakers. She knew that if she failed, all women fail. But her buddies who all went to film school, they were all that first generation through the Australian film school. If Philip Noyce failed, Philip Noyce failed, right? If Peter Weir failed, Peter Weir failed. But all the other men were fine. If she failed, that was it for women. So she couldn't, she had this extra pressure on her. Yeah, she had this extra pressure on her. And I think she really rose to the challenge. She made a freaking amazing film. And has, obviously, I think Australia has a really rich history of women directors coming after her. But it's kind of scary to think if she had failed, like, would we have Jane Campion? Would we have, Jocelyn Moorhouse? I don't know. Like, it's hard to say. I know Jane Campion's from New Zealand, but she started working in Australia. So.
I mean, that shows the importance of having a role model, and also it shows how perhaps change can come quicker than you expect, because as soon as you've got one, then you've got four, you know, and then you've got seven, and then you've got 18,
and I think part of the reason I wanted to make sure I had women who had started working as early as the 70s all the way through, I think the most recent debut was like 2012, was I wanted to see, I didn't know if I would see it, but I was hoping maybe I'd see it, like the way that the various generations of directors inspired each other to keep going. Because I just know from my own personal experience as a woman and girl growing up that whenever I saw a woman doing something, I was like, oh, okay, a woman can't do that. And I think by the time we've gotten to Gen Z, there's so few things women haven't at least one woman done that I don't know that the younger generation now even needs that as badly. I think there's obviously representation is still very important, but there's less of like, I didn't see it, so I didn't think I could be it. Like, I think I kind of love that Gen Z and Gen Z's kids that are starting to be born, which is terrifying. There's very few things girls are going to grow up thinking they can't do. And I grew up in the 90s. So because of a lawsuit that got dismissed, but like got a lot of press, the Hollywood studios were sort of pressured into hiring a lot more women for 2 decades, a decade and a half. So I grew up with that crop of directors. And so I also didn't really think, oh, this can't be done, because, I grew up with Penelope Spheres making films and Amy Heckerling and Nancy Meyers and Nora Ephron and like Penny Marshall, and like they were all working in the Hollywood system. But a lot of the women I spoke to came of age before that, right? They're the ones that sort of pushed that to be available. And then some of the later filmmakers that I talked to, I think some of them didn't see those films or I was always kind of, my mom was always making me read the credits, so I was always paying attention to who was directing. But I think even if you grow up with that, if you're not actually paying attention to who's making the films, you might not, especially with the Oscars being like what, at least in the United States, the Oscars are the pinnacle of what people are paying attention to movies, right? So if the bias falls into the Oscars and you'll just have Jane Campion for the entire 90s, it does seem like only maybe Jane Campion is the only one making making films if you're a kid when you want to become a director.
I mean, it's an interesting thing as well, though, that again, a sort of thing that crops up a number of times in your book is how some directors, especially because they're making independent movies, sort of rights issues and films sort of disappear from circulation and
Oh yeah.
so some steps forward slide back as well. I wanted to go on. I wanted to ask you something which is kind of like, it's 2 points. I hope I can formulate this into a coherent question. Here goes. So there's a great point that Alison Anders makes in the interview you did with her, where she's talking about watching a scene and she's noticed that sort of passionate sex scenes become this sort of, they're tearing each other's clothes off. It's like and it's like, oh, what? There's no foreplay anymore. Is that what we're supposed to be? Is that what we're supposed to be doing? And I thought, oh, that's really interesting how that way of looking. I don't want to necessarily say it's a specifically male way of looking at something, but anyway, you're getting a different perspective on a phenomena, and it's an interesting way. And I just thought, if when you had your year of watching female directors, women directors making movies, did something sort of spring out at you that you were sort of thinking, oh wow, this is looked at in a different, or this pops up much more common, or I haven't seen that for a few months because that doesn't seem to be a particular concern of these filmmakers?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely did. I saw a lot less ogling of women, unless it was purposeful for actual sexual reasons, like a man wanting to hit on a woman or a lesbian wanting to hit on another woman. Like if it was purposeful ogling, it was there, right? Character-driven ogling, I guess. But there was a lot less of that like Michael Bay leering on Megan Fox's butt kind of stuff, right? Like
that's got to be the name of your next book, by the way.
Yeah.
Character-driven ogling.
So there was a lot less of like that, a lot more purposeful panning of women's bodies, if at all. I also really noticed a lot more like contemplative, emotive performances from men. I don't want to get too like gender binary or anything, but I did notice at least in the films I chose to watch, that there were a lot of more sort of internal stories for the male characters in some of the films I watched. I'm thinking of like Susan Bier's After the Wedding with Mads Mikkelsen. It's not. I mean, he's always kind of a really contemplative kind of director, but I feel like the way she used close-ups on him wasn't something I had really seen in terms of crafting a male performance before. And she wouldn't just do close-ups of like his face too. It would be because he's a dancer. He's such a sort of making for like his whole body is the performance, no matter what kind of performance he's doing. And she would do these like close-ups of his hand and like the emotions in his hand, and it was just such a sensitive way of capturing that character's journey. And I felt like I had not seen very many male performances filmed that way, that were really patient and I think more honest to just how people are and more vulnerable. Whereas, especially in Hollywood, you get a lot of like gruff men shooting things, and then they're like, if they have a sad moment, they're just like their heads between their legs or something, like, but their gun is still on their hip or whatever. I'm thinking of like John Wick. I don't know. Like there's certain ways within Hollywood filmmaking to show this is a tough but sensitive man, and that's not what I saw. I saw actual sensitivity. I felt like the other thing that is numerical, so I felt it, but it's also like empirically true, is that women tend to cast more women in their films, whether it's because they've written more women characters or they're just more cognizant of the fact that when you go through the world, you're seeing about 50% women. And so you just in the background in minor characters, you see a lot more women. You also tend to see in films by women that are about women, you tend to actually see complex female friendships. There are some male directors who have managed to do that over the years. Obviously, Pedro Almodovar is one of the great contemporary filmmakers about women and women's friendships, but it's still less often. Whereas with films by women, you see like one of my favorite films I saw during A Year with Women was Crossing Delancey, and what I particularly love about that film, obviously I did not talk to Jo Micklin Silver because she's dead, but if she had been alive, she would have been in this book. But that character, that script, which was written by Susan Sandler, the Izzy character, she has so many different relationships in that. She has the two men, obviously, but she has one friend group that never meets the other friend group. She has the bubby. She has her work friends. Like, she has all these different friend groups, many of which don't meet each other, but meet her because she's the sort of center. I can't think of very few in any of the films I've ever seen where you actually see a woman's life so fully fleshed out that she has like her 4 friend groups that never meet. And it doesn't feel like choppy or chapters or anything. That's just her life. And you're like watching her life. And I do think that is something you get a little more care of when a woman is at the helm because she's thinking about her own way of going through life. I think Susan Seidelman also does that really, really well. Her films tend to have, anywhere from 5 to 25 women on screen going through whatever it is they're going through.
Most people will know her from Desperately Seeking Susan, although, as you say, she's done a whole bunch of films around that period, especially that was just a sort of, a real miracle period.
Yeah, and she had a lot of trouble getting some of those later films made. Like Desperately Seeking Susan was a struggle because it was her first major Hollywood film, but after it was a big success and obviously was part of the formula that made Madonna the big superstar that she is, those next 3 films she struggled to get made because she quote unquote was focusing too much on women, and she's like, okay, but so and then when both Cookie and She Devil didn't do as well as they should have, finding funding for her next few projects just became harder and harder, and everything else she made pretty much was either independent or through television. But I like that she continued to make that she didn't care. She just continued to make films about women her age, whatever age she was, and she just kept doing it on whatever budget she could get. I really respect that.
Because it's funny, you say in the introduction to the book, you're talking about how, I think it's in the introduction, might be in one of your questions, but it reminded me, I was talking to Janine Basinger a while ago, and she was saying how, you had this period in Hollywood where all the stars were women, that people were going to see Joan Crawford, they were going to see
exactly.
Betty Davis, and it was and it was mainly because the audience was hugely motivated with women. There were women who were going to go and see all these films, so they had their dollars were dictating what was going up on the screen, even if maybe the men, well, the vast majority of the people behind the camera were men. And you were sort of saying that, this is the bit in the introduction that you say, you've got to get the boyfriend along to see the film, so it can't be too.
I think that's in one of the questions.
It's maybe one of the questions. Yes, I think so. I remember it being your voice rather than one of your subjects. And I just wondered where and how that sort of changed. That why are we not dragging the boys to seeing?
I think in the United States it tracks to unfortunately, like when the production code fell and the Hollywood star system fell, there was a big reorientation of what it was to make a Hollywood film, right? And I think what kind of the baby that got thrown out with the bathwater was like Hollywood knew you had your female stars, you had your male stars, right? And they kind of threw everything out. And there's like 2 quotes. I can't remember who said either quote, but one of the quote was that Hollywood basically started making films for teenage boys And unfortunately, as you can probably see from the kind of Hollywood-backed films now, we haven't really stopped making films mostly for teenage boys. But the teenage boys are just now 50. And then there's a great quote from one of the actresses who was coming of age at that era. And I can't for life of me remember if it was Jane Fonda or if it was Shirley MacLaine, but it was one of them very vocal, like feminist actresses from the late 60s, early 70s, who was on a talk show. And she basically said, with women's liberation, women got out of the kitchen. And for a while, they had complex films. But then they ended up, once the production code fell, they ended up in the bedroom. And we've not been able to get back out of the bedroom. And I think what she was saying is essentially women, you know, during the production code, women got to be all these tough, amazing things. And sometimes those films would end with like them getting, because a woman empowers emasculating, they would end up becoming married or whatever. And it's
the domestication.
Yeah, they get domesticated, and that's like the whole plot. And that's depressing. There's way too many of those in the 50s. But once they had that liberation, instead of seeing like a woman just being the president of a college and that's her life, now she's being seduced, and now we're getting all these women that are just sex objects even more so than they ever were. I mean, there's a great line in Girlfriends, which is from not Girlfriends, An Unmarried Woman, which is Paul Mazursky, who is a man, but he made one of the great films about women, where all the women are together on the bed with Jill Clayburgh, and they're talking about like, where are all the female stars? Like, there was just that shift. And I think it was really the youth market coming in and taking over did not help. It helped to make a lot of money. And then you had these films that made a lot of money, and they were like Star Wars and Jaws and films that just didn't, other than Princess Leia, didn't really center women. And so Hollywood always tends to make decisions based on box office. And because the biggest box office hits keep being these films by, for, and about men, and women are more likely to watch films by, for, and about men than it seems to, at least in my experience, men to watch films solely about women. Unless it's like an art house film and you're an art house like kind of person, you might do it. But even today, some of my peers, I'll see them watch, you know, this fifth film from some shitty male director that they're like, maybe he'll get it this time. And then I'll be like, okay, what about this woman who's made 5 good films? Do you know any of her films? And they're like, and I'm like, why are you wasting your time watching a mediocre man fail over and over when you have all these women you could be watching? Like, I don't understand that. But I think it's just people get in habits. Hollywood has told us this is the habits we should be in. It's very powerful. To grow up watching a certain kind of movie and then not even think to get outside that.
Is there a possibility as well that sort of like there's a kind of, it's a little bit like you mentioned right at the beginning of our conversation, so that when you sort of study literature, it's sort of like, let's look at all of these male authors and, oh yeah, there are these women who write about women, you know, and we'll look at them, but we'll look at them in the context of like, they're the vegetables of the bunch. They're the thing you do.
You might get one Edith Wharton novel and be happy about that.
you kind of do that thing of taking a deep breath before you do, because you're doing it because it's good for you. And I'm not in any way saying that Edith Wharton's an amazing writer, and you know, the female novelists of that period, you know, I sound like way too defensive saying that, but what I mean to say is, that's not how I'm suggesting that I feel, but it's almost how it's framed. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
So it's like, so it's kind of, it's not, let's watch The Hurt Locker. It's let's watch, you know, the Chantal Akerman film that won Sight and Sound's top poll, which I have to say, that sort of took the wind out of my sails a little bit, because I was thinking, there are so many better films by women than that one to have done.
No, John Dielman was my number one.
Was that your number one? Okay, let's fight.
Yeah.
Let's have a girl fight.
Yeah,
to quote Karen Kusama.
When I got the invite, I was not expecting
That's your first
an invite. Yeah, it was my first ballot, and I was like, holy shit. But I was like, okay, I'm putting John Dielman on there, and then I'll figure out the other 9 from there. That was a film I saw during A Year with Women, and I was so blown away with everything that Chantal wanted to make you feel with that
Right.
film. She wants you to feel what it was to be her mother.
Right.
And I'm a big fan of films that she doesn't tell you how to feel, she makes you feel it. And I love films that make me feel something. And I don't feel like bludgeoned into feeling it. I just feel it, if that makes sense. And I think that's one of the things Ackerman was a master of, is just she knows she's taking your time, and she's taking your time. I kind of love that about her films. But I've seen that film now on the big screen several times, and I just think it is so transfixing, and so I don't know how she crafted something so rigid yet fluid at 25. Like, her mastery of how to use cinema is just beyond. What is it that you don't, like about it?
I'm not going to say anything bad about it. And let me caveat this, first of all, by saying the idea of a best film ever is utterly ridiculous.
It's bullshit. Yeah, it's bullshit.
So
I get that.
everybody's making a decision based on sort of what I would like to see, or what how I would like to be seen, as well as what I think you should see. That's it's a recommendation. It's partly a self-portrait. Any of those lists, and I was distressed that at my top 10, I didn't have a single woman, to the point that I wrote a blog post entitled "Why I Didn't Put a Woman on My Top 10 List," and hopefully it was explanatory enough, or I don't know. It's an issue I haven't quite resolved yet. When it came to Chantal's Jean Delmain, is that a correct pronunciation?
Is Jean Delman.
Jean Delman, thank you.
There you go. That's closer. That's closer.
We're not going to do the whole title.
Yeah, French. Yeah, you don't have to do it.
I mean, I get it. I like modernist filmmaking. I like a slow cinema. I understand the immersion. I understand that being a bit bored is the point. You're supposed to be sitting there being a bit bored. But I kind of also thought that there's an element in which Sight and Sound, a little bit like we were talking about the Oscars earlier, is kind of an advert for cinema. And you're kind of saying, watch this. This is something that will. And I think Jean Demain does that to a certain degree. It does it to a certain part of the audience. But I don't think it would do that. I don't think it's something that. And you could say, well, that audience is the readership of Sight and Sound, so yeah, let it be whatever. But it just felt to me a little bit. It just was like, I don't know if you're doing the film any favors. I don't know if I'm sitting down thinking, so this is going to be the best film according to Sight and Sound. Here we go.
Yeah, but you could say the exact same thing about Citizen Kane. Like, a lot of normies do not like Citizen Kane, and then they come out of it thinking it's the best film of all time, and they're like, fuck this film. Like, that has been my experience with Citizen Kane. When I tell people I love Citizen Kane, it's one of my all-time favorite films. I've seen it on the big screen like 8 times. I will, if it's playing, I'm seeing it. But I even in film school, I came across a lot of people who are like, it's fine. I don't think it's the best film of all time. I think any film, whether it's Ackerman, Hitchcock, Kane, whatever, the minute you call it the best film of all time, it's gonna have its haters. What I think is important about it hitting the number one spot, one, is that it just completely shook up that list, and that list had been really stagnant. And I think the only way to change how people think about what the possibility of film as a medium is to shake it up that badly. And I think honestly, I wish that list had gotten shooken up a little bit more, because there was still some gaps in terms of what I think cinema is that are still not on the 100 list, right? But the other thing is, I don't think it was as shocking that Jean Dielman got as high on there as it was. It was the only film directed by women that was on the 2012 list. And it was low because it hadn't been available. It hadn't been commercially available for decades. And by the time the 2012 list came out, it had only been on home video for a very short while. So more people had access to it, which I'm bringing this back to the point of the book. I think the more people have access to a film, any kind of film, the more likely they are to think more broadly about what film can be. And so Sight and Sound tends to the films that tend to top Sight and Sound are the most accessible films. Look at most of the lists, and it's things like Vertigo that has never fallen out. It's Rules of the Game. It's always been available, right? You started to see a little bit of recency bias with like Portrait of a Lady on Fire, but you also started to see films that are older but have finally had an ability for more audiences to see them. So I don't think that John Dielman was just, oh, I need to have a woman and a bunch of people put it on there. I think it was truly a reflection, partly that, but I think it was truly a reflection of what access to cinema can do. And that film by 2022, not only had that film had that earlier DVD release, it had a Blu-ray, it had a new restoration, it had been playing, to my earlier point about Chantal Akerman, she had passed away, so there were retrospectives. So I think more people had just seen the film. And I think a lot of the discussion about what does this mean, and was it just a bunch of people putting one woman on the list, and of course that's the film. I think it's a little of all of that. But I don't think in the discussion after that happened, there was a lot of discussion about how access changes, because that's not the only film that access helped it. Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust ended up on the list. That had also just had a restoration less than 10 years before the new Sight and Sound. More people were watching it. It was finally being discussed as not just one of the great independent films, but one of the great films, period, right? Cheryl Dunye's Watermelon Woman was in the top, I think it was like 130 or something, like barely missed out. That had just had a restoration and had just been starting to talk about it. So what I'm really curious to see is like John Dielman topping that list that year. Will it top again in 10 years? I'm not sure. What I think we will see, though, is a lot more women on that list solely because people are seeing their films. Not because they're trying to make a political statement, but truly they're seeing the films. The films are getting access. And having something like John Dielman top it pushes the distributors. It pushes the people making Blu-rays. It pushes everybody in the ecosystem to take more women filmmakers seriously. And so even though it was my number one film anyways, and I loved it, I love what it's going to do in terms of pushing what is discoverable for all audiences into a wider scope of films. That's my spiel.
That's brilliant. Well, that's excellent. I consider myself told.
But I understand. I don't want to feel like I'm a man. I don't want to say like people who didn't have films by women on their list is a bad thing. It is what it is. I also think, like my whole list was films by women, partly because obviously that's what I do, partly because I think those 10 films that I chose are fucking great films. And what I think mostly still irritates me is that, and this has been the case the whole 10 years I've been advocating for women in film, is that there's always somebody coming in there being like, I don't care the person's gender, I just want a good film. And I'm like, okay, have you watched these films? And if you say that to the guy, it's usually a guy, no offense to the dudes out there, but it's usually some guy. And I'm like, okay, in the whatever film it is they're complaining about, or I curated a letterbox list of one film from each of these filmmakers, and several people were like, I don't care what the gender is. And I'm like, how many of these 19 films did you see? And inevitably they have not seen the film, and so they don't know if it's a good film or not, regardless. And I think one of the main things I've learned in both the scholarship, but also just like being a woman on the internet, is people don't know their biases. They don't know that they're missing something, right? And what I've heard from people who have picked up some of the challenges, whether it's A Year with Women or the 52 Films by Women, or just approaching a film festival and thinking, I'm going to try to see half the films directed by women, right? They'll go back and look at their previous festivals, and they go, oh, wow, I didn't pick any women, and I didn't even know. Like, they didn't mean to not pick any women. They just didn't. And I think that's usually what happens. It's rarely out of malice. It's mostly out of, I just didn't even realize I wasn't even trying. And so, it's less about like, these are better. great quote from Gene Siskel, the late great Gene Siskel. Love him or hate him, he had some really interesting things to say about film, and he actually programmed, or he didn't program, but he initiated the first women's film festival here in Chicago. And it was because he'd seen a film, a French Canadian film, randomly when he was out of town, and the way that the filmmaker had filmed, it was called Dream Life. And the way the filmmaker had filmed this one scene was a scene he'd seen before in a bunch of films by men, but he'd never seen it from the perspective of the female character. It was like women getting hit on, but she filmed it from in the car with the women. And it made him realize how many perspectives in film had he not seen, because he'd only seen it from the male perspective. And so he's like, I want to see more films by women, not because they're better, but because they're going to be slightly different. Yeah. And I think the main point I've been trying to make is, I'm not saying these women are better filmmakers. In some cases, yes, they are empirically better filmmakers than men that people focus on. But that's not the point. It's going to be different. And so I tend to watch as many films by women as I can, whether I think the film's going to be good or not, because I don't care if it's not going to be good. I want the women to have a chance to make another film. And, there's been enough men making films. We need to swing it a little bit that way, because the men are still going to be making films. They're not going to struggle. They'll be fine.
Don't worry about us. We'll be okay.
I don't worry about them. No.
I mean, I just pulled up the post that I did, because I was suddenly had a horror that you would visit the blog and you would see it say like, I like Woody Allen and
I would
Louis
never.
CK.
I would never.
And now I've remembered my defense, because it's not a defense. It's me saying the subtitle of the post. It's on Substack, if anybody can stomach, apparently, a terrible blogging platform. The subtitle is called An Attempt at a Rectification. And then I talk about the various sort of quibbles and all the rest of it. And I put up quite a staunch argument. And then towards the end, I say, and then I realized Clueless. Clueless by Amy Heckerling is one of my favorite films ever. What the fuck? How would I not put Clueless? I mean, I'd need to lose Shoah or Blade Runner. I had considered Jane Campion, but Clueless is definitely in my top 10.
Honestly, I left Clueless off because...
What were you thinking?
No, I thought it was safe. I truly thought...
Oh, right.
Yeah, because when I had done during A Year with Women, I did a poll, and it ended up being 103 films because there were some ties. I don't like it when people do a tie, and so they're like 97 3 times or whatever. I'm like, no, if there's ties, it's going to be a little more than 100, and that's what I did. So Clueless topped the list. I ended up on what is that horrible blogger guy? Jeff Wells. I ended up getting this horrible email from Jeff Wells. I don't know if you know him across the pond. I don't know. He's the worst.
I know him by sight. I've seen the back of his head on numerous occasions.
I'm sure some listeners are triggered. I got a horrible email from him about, like, why is Clueless topping this list? And quite honestly, I gave him an answer of, I think it's about accent. I think that's one of the truly great films by women that most people have seen, because it was made in the Hollywood system and it has never been inaccessible. And that's why it topped the list. It's great and it's accessible. That goes back to the John Diamond of it all. But I thought Clueless, I truly didn't think Clueless needed my help to make the Sight and Sound list. And so I swapped in, I think, probably Hester Street instead, because I felt like Hester Street, no one was going to have it. Turned out I was the only one that I think that had Hester Street. So, but I thought Clueless, we both messed up.
What I'm hearing in this conversation is we both fucked up.
So 2032 Clueless, it needs to be on there. Also,
it needs to be number 1, frankly.
Comedy tends to not make it on these kind of lists, which is also bullshit. And I think Clueless is truly one of the great films. I showed it to my mom a couple of years ago. She'd never seen it. And the first, 15, 20 minutes, she's like, I don't know. By the end of the movie, she's like, I think that's the finest comedic performance I've seen on film since Marilyn Monroe and Some Like It Hot. And I'm like, thank you. I'm going to extend that to Alicia. Like, I don't know Alicia Silverstone, but if she's listening, my mom's opinion.
Big fan. First time caller, long time fan.
It's so good, and it's endlessly rewatchable. I fucking love Clueless. I actually tried to I tried to get Amy Heckerling in the book, and I emailed with her assistant for six months. But she's a very busy woman, and I was not able ultimately to get on her schedule, which was a shame because I really just wanted to talk about Clueless. But you know, I think she's a filmmaker who probably doesn't necessarily need my help to like people know her. So, or you should if you're listening and you haven't watched Clueless, like just pause it and watch Clueless and then come back to the
Exactly.
podcast.
I completely endorse that message. No,
Yeah.
absolutely. I only saw it about 4 or 5 years ago. It was very recent compared to when.
Oh, wow.
And it was my daughters said had watched it, and they said you've got to watch this, and we watched it. It's like maybe 2 or 3 years ago, actually. 4 or 5 sounds a lot. And so we watched it, and I was knocked out by it, and I was like
Yeah.
saying how good it was, and they just thought I was taking the piss. They weren't trusting me at all. I was going that
Oh,
I was saying like that's like a 5-star classic. That is one of the best comedies I've ever
yeah.
seen. And they were like, "All right, you didn't like it. Next time you can choose." And it was like, "No, honestly, honestly, I'm not kidding you. I'm not kidding you." Bottoms as well is another great comedy, which is
Oh, I love Bottoms.
I think that should be number 2 on the Sight and Sound list now.
I got to interview Emma Siegelman for Shiva Baby back before it broke out, before it was like a
Mm.
big cult hit. She was one of the first filmmakers I interviewed when I shifted to being a full-time writer again. And she's so smart and funny. I will watch she's on that list. Like if people don't already have her on their list of filmmakers that they'll watch everything she's made, they're already making a mistake because you're already 2 films behind, but it's not too late. Watch Shiva Baby, watch Bottoms, then you'll be ready for her third film.
Yeah, absolutely. I co-sign.
Get on the bottom floor.
Mariah, I mean, this book is great. It really
Thank you.
revived my my interest in a lot of filmmakers I already knew about. It gave me some names of filmmakers that I had maybe seen one film, or I'd heard of them more than seen, and then that made me adjust my letterboxed watch list accordingly.
You love to hear it.
It was full of great conversations. I love the fact that you call it, you have these series of conversations, a real back and forth, and it brings these
Yeah,
filmmakers to
I
life.
I really I really wanted to have I had two most women I had two questions I asked them the same question, which was the when did you want to realize you want to become a filmmaker, and are there any women that either inspire you or that you want other people to see, right? But everything in the middle was bespoke per filmmaker based on, the research, but also just my own observations. So in a way, it is their stories, but it is also, I'm not going to lie, a bit my own criticism in terms of what I think is interesting about them as filmmakers and trying to pull out their own perspectives on my critiques, I guess. So that was actually my biggest, I really appreciate that compliment because my biggest fear was that people were going to read it and be like, who is this idiot?
No, no, not at all.
like, because that's always with interviews. There's like, obviously there's two ways to do them. You have the rote questions, which I find are the most boring interviews, or you have real conversations. And I love to have real conversations. So I was hoping that is entertaining for other people because,
Yeah.
if I'm going to spend 4 years on a book, I want to really enjoy myself in the process. I mean, as you know, you've written a book. I both enjoyed it and hated exactly what Allison said actually about filmmaking. I had the best time of my life making this book, and I had the absolute like most anxiety I've ever had in my entire life. A lot of antacids went into the making of this book.
Well, I think one thing it does is it also gives a really clear through line to the book. That lots of people will maybe read the book as like dip in and read their favorite interviews and then come back after they'd watch a film and read more of the interviews. But I've read it cover to cover, and the thing that you get is because your personality is there in your questions and your conversation, is you do get sort of a through line. You do get a feeling that you're meeting these people consistently, rather than every interview is either overly robotic or changes too much with the different personality of the filmmaker. You've always got that thread to sort of hold on to. So I really loved it.
I appreciate that.
I'm going to stop gushing about you now. for a second and allow you to gush about somebody else, because time has come for your recommended film book.
Yeah. I wanted to do two real quick because one, you mentioned Ginny Basinger, and I just wanted to shout out her book Silent Stars, because my other favorite love is silent film, and if I was going to could do any book I wanted, it would basically be my own version of Silent Stars. But I feel like Janine is so well respected a scholar that she was able to make that book. I don't know that I can convince a publisher to let me write my own version of Silent Stars with like the like really obscure silent people that I love. So I think that book is precious, and I love that she loves John Gilbert. It's some of the best writing ever about John Gilbert, the great John Gilbert. But the book I really wanted to shout out is a brand new book. It just came out a couple days ago. It's called Love Queenie, and it's the first full-length biography of Merle Oberon in, I think, 50 years. It's by an author named Mayuk Sen, and it's looking at her legacy as a South Asian actress who passed as white, and what that means in terms of how we think about film history. Like she's continually, she was the first South Asian actress nominated for Best Actress, but when Michelle Yeoh was nominated, a lot of headlines said it was her because they didn't count Merle Oberon either because they didn't know, or the fact that she was, passing makes the accomplishment diminishes the accomplishment, which I think is bullshit. And Merle's one of my like all-time favorite actresses of any generation, period. So the fact that there's a whole biography of her. And originally my book was supposed to come out on March 4th. And so Mayok and I were supposed to be pub twins. And then my book got pulled back. It got delivered to the warehouse early, and so they released it a week early. So we're no longer pub twins, but we're spiritually pub twins. And so I want to shout out his book. I can't wait to read it. I hope he gets to get we get more of these Merle Oberon movies back into the public consciousness, because she's such an interesting film actress and screen presence, and I just love the idea of really delving deep into like why someone like her had to pass both in the British film industry and the American film industry, why she couldn't just be mixed race South Asian actress. She's so talented, she's so beautiful, but racism, and shame and all of those things just prevail. So, but no longer,
Oh yeah, no, it's all done. It's all cured now, apparently.
Yeah, we're all good now.
Everything's fine. Nothing to see here. Nothing to see.
Yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit. I mean, it's totally different as well, but also a little bit the same. What happened to Rita Hayworth when she got to Hollywood, and they, completely changed her appearance and name and everything, and
they had to completely make her look as white as possible. It's awful. Yeah,
exactly.
And I mean, both of these women are so beautiful and so talented, and it's like that like white supremacy just really is a powerful thing, I guess.
And it goes with what you were saying earlier about Gene Siskel and what he said. It's not only it's about I as a man want to see. I mean, that's why I go to the cinema. I want to see things from points of view which are not my own. I don't want to be reinforced. I don't want to see John Wick because I have that. I have enough male rage. I don't need any more. Thank you very much.
To tie Merle Oberon back to women directors, she made one of the last films with Dorothy Arzner. It's called First Comes Courage. It's a war film. She's fantastic in it. Dorothy Arzner, another filmmaker who a handful of her films are available, but the ones that are restored don't always make it onto like DVD, Blu-ray streaming, and so we should have a petition to get more of them out there, because she's a great filmmaker, and she worked with all these amazing actresses. She worked with Merle, she worked with Joan Crawford, she worked with Sylvia Sidney, like you name it. Great filmmaker.
Absolutely. Listen, Mariah, Cinema Her Way is available now from everywhere you get good books. I'll put a link in the show notes. And it is in the UK.
I have seen pictures of it at the BFI. I've seen pictures of it in Wales, and I've seen pictures of it in Birmingham. My friend lives in Birmingham. She sent me a picture. So Excellent. If you're listening in the UK, it is available. If it's not at your bookstore, demand it. They'll stock it.
Absolutely. I have lots of listeners in the UK. Majority of my listeners are actually in America. Would you?
Really? Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I live in Italy. I've never been in.
Oh, in Italy. Well, Rizzoli is an Italian. Rizzoli is an Italian. I forgot that you live in Italy. Rizzoli is an Italian publisher, so I think it's also available in Italy.
Oh, well, there you go. Absolutely. Yeah,
I would hope.
Yeah,
I totally
brilliant.
forgot that you're based in Italy.
No, it's okay. It's fine. It's fine. I'll forgive you.
The continent.
I've Brexited, so
I mean,
no.
the way it's going here, we might have to you exited soon too. So
This is
I
the
made that
thing
word up.
it's going to be everybody wants to just get out of their own country somehow. So it's
And then where are we going to end up? It's hard to say.
Yeah, Canada probably.
Yeah.
We could all go to Greenland and just stay there. Fantastic.
Unless that becomes part of the United States.
Oh man, don't.
Sorry, too soon.
No, it's actually anticipating it. It's not even happened yet, and we're already saying it. No, let's hope things change for the better. They've got to. And while they, until then, cinema, music and books.
Yeah, that's what I do. That's what I focus on.
and lovely conversations. Thank you.
Which is my other favorite thing.
Yeah, thank you, Marya. I really enjoyed talking to you today.
Thank you for having me.